All right, let's go ahead and get this thing started.
All right.
Yoav, what's happening, man? How are you?
What's going on? I'm good. I'm good. I'm glad that you can host me today. I'm just gonna start sharing my screen now.
There we go. For a bit of context, everyone, if you haven't heard of Say Less, Yoav's going to talk about it in just a minute. But I've been using it. The way that we talked to each other and we met up is that I was using Say Less because I saw it on Twitter, I think. Saw somebody posted it on Twitter, and I ended up being like, whoa, that's really cool. The little demo, the 10-second video demo that you had. And I have the tendency to ramble. I don't know about the rest of you. This is probably what I saw on Twitter. And
Yeah.
so I was rambling in my emails like I do. And I saw this video and it was like, oh man, I need that. Wait a minute. How do I get this? And it was before it was out. Now it is a Google Chrome plugin. So if you don't have it, go check it out. It's very cool. And if you do have it, I'd love to hear how you've been liking it. I've been using it for the past probably like 2 weeks and enjoying it. It gets myself out of trouble sometimes. Other times, like I mentioned, it comes up with some funny stuff. So now I'm going to hand the microphone over to you, Yoav. This is really exciting stuff. I'm happy that you're here. Thank you for coming. And I'll let you talk, and then we'll ask some questions at the end there. I think you said we'll have a bit of time. If anybody wants to interject with questions, feel free. I will stop him in his tracks, and then we can get those answered. So without further ado, Yoav, take it over.
All right. Thank you, D, for that very warm introduction. Welcome, everyone. So this is Say Less. It's really exciting to hear that at least someone's been getting some interesting use out of it. So this is Say Less. This is the GIF that basically describes it. The basic idea is you're writing an email. It might be getting long. You do this thing, and it gets shorter. That's the premise. And in this conversation, I'll be in this presentation, I'll be taking you through basically, the entire process from ideation, like, oh, I have this interesting idea, to like what it looks like to launch it. And hopefully that'll be kind of interesting to this community. So there'll be a little bit of machine learning, a little bit of production, and then I'll leave some time at the end for questions.
Definitely.
So this is interesting. So this is the slide where I get to brag a little bit. When I released it, it was on Product Hunt, Hacker News. Someone told me this morning that it was on Morning Brew, which is like a newsletter for with like a lot of subscribers. So yeah, it's done pretty well. And the reason I have this slide is because of this next slide, which is you might be surprised, some of you might be disappointed, some of you might be excited that I did actually no training for this project at all. I didn't use any GPUs. Yeah, it was actually mostly like off-the-shelf models. So I kind of like this. I think it's quite interesting because it shows that, you can do something valuable without spending a boatload of money and a bunch of time here. Cool. So this is kind of the presentation outline that I have today. So walking through the different steps. So we'll first talk about, summarization and machine learning in general. Then kind of the stages from ideation to production here. As a brief introduction, this is who I am. I've done some work at Google. I've done some work at a startup called Determined AI that did open source deep learning training infrastructure. And now I'm working on a startup called ModelZoo, which I'll mention a little bit later. So I come from kind of machine learning and infrastructure background. So let's start with a problem that I noticed. So, this is kind of a problem that's been in the back of my mind for like a few months now. And I'll just point out some pointers that, I came across as I was considering it. So email overload, right? No one likes, or not that many people actually like to use email. Everyone seems to have a ton of email and then like doesn't really want to like, it's just kind of this like annoying chore that most people have to do. There's this thing called 5 sentences, which is basically this like manifesto of like, you know, email should always be under 5 sentences. And I've encountered some people that have this in their email signature. That's just like, they just like have this like rigid rule. There's also this blog post I came across by this guy named Greg Kogan. This guy, Greg, basically is a B2B growth / marketing like consultant. He's worked with a lot of big companies. And he spends a lot of time thinking about like things like email marketing and like when you sign up for a service as a free trial, someone sends you an email, like how that email is worded and what's the best way to get conversions from that email. So he had this blog post called "To Get More Replies, Say Less." You can notice that my name was kind of actually inspired by this blog post. So he actually found that in this specific use case of email marketing, you can you cut the email length by 90%. You increase conversions. You increase the amount of people that reply to you by 9%, by 8 times. So like he's interested in this email of short. He's interested in this idea of short emails. Another inspiration.
Just real quick.
So
I love the inspiration from that. I was going to ask about it. We have somebody asking in the chat from that last slide what a GPU is. You were saying no training, no GPU. What's a GPU?
A GPU is a graphics processing unit. Cool. It's like specialized hardware for typically used for training deep learning models.
Cool.
Okay. So yeah, summarization. So we talked about the problem. Now like summarization is kind of this, on the solution side, this idea in machine learning that machine learning, just NLP in general, that people have been thinking about for a while. You know, given a passage of text, how can a computer make it, you know, improve the brevity? So there's 2 kind of main buckets. One is extractive summarization on the top here, which basically says the computer or the algorithm that produces the summary doesn't produce anything new. They just kind of cut down the original passage. So maybe they'll like take a few words from here. Maybe they'll take a new sentence. Maybe they'll just remove some sentences. But at the end of the day, it's basically just you know, copying with removing some stuff. Now, abstractive summarization on the bottom here is kind of the more interesting and more difficult problem, because abstractive summarization says actually synthesize the entire passage and come up with a novel summary. So if you're doing abstractive summarization, you might actually end up with words that were not in the original passage, like hospitalized down here, for instance. So, you know, abstractive summarization is a little closer to like how a human would summarize something, but is a much more difficult NLP problem because you have to, you know, understand the context of the entire language that you're dealing with and synonyms and all that. So abstractive summarization has always been a tough problem for NLP researchers, and it's just started to get pretty good with deep learning. So that was kind of one insight. And this is from a recent paper that Google published. It's called, they published this model called Pegasus in June 2020. So it's fairly recent. You know, there's some numbers here. It doesn't exactly, I won't get into specifics of exactly how these evaluation metrics are computed, but the broad point here is that thanks to these new deep learning architectures, abstractive summarization is actually starting to get kind of good enough. And in some cases where the numbers are bolded, actually better than a human, or not worse than a human. So they actually ran this algorithm side by side with someone that they said, oh, summarize these passages, and they kind of compared them with a neutral third party, almost like kind of a Turing test. Okay, cool. So we have a problem, we have a potential solution. So how did I get started on this? Well, let's start from the most simple place. So let's take a model. And at the time, when I was building this, I don't know if this is still true, but Pegasus was still kind of like, I couldn't find any, I wanted to start with Pegasus, but I couldn't find any like great implementations or easy to use implementations out there of it. So I chose a similar model, which is Facebook BART. And BART is another like transform architecture that was released by Facebook instead of Google, but it's in a similar vein. They also have some benchmarks that do pretty well with abstractive summarization. And that's the kind of simplest model that I could find that was, you know, quick to use. And with the data set, you know, I went to find the kind of easiest possible like data set I could use that could still kind of apply to this problem, which is this DailyMail CNN data set. So this is a summarization data set. Basically, it's 300,000 news articles. And the task is condition on a news article, compute the summary of that news article. And because it's CNN, they have these summaries that have already been written by editors. Sometimes they're like headlines, sometimes they're just like more of the summary that they have before you click onto the article. But because these exist, we can kind of use them. And in research, this is the kind of the most common data set that is used, and a lot of benchmarks are run on this data set. So here's an example of what something looks like. So it's like, this is in particular a sports article. So you see the top is the full article, the bottom is the summary. Cool. So there's this great library out there. It's called Hugging Face. I highly recommend everyone checks it out. They do open source transformers, deep learning models. So they take a lot of the stuff that's in most recent like research papers with NLP, and they create easy ways to use it. So they create a library that has like a very simple wrapper to utilize these problems. They also have this model hub where people kind of fine tune on these different new models on new data sets, and they upload the weights. So it's like easy for anyone to kind of use these weights quickly and test out these models. And one of the big reasons that I picked Facebook and BART and DailyMail was Hugging Face already had a model that was they had open for public use, where Facebook AI had trained or fine-tuned their pre-trained BART model on the DailyMail data set that I just talked about. So prototype, this is what it looks like. It's only like 10 lines of Python. So I have like, you know, this is the Hugging Face library up here. I have like a sample email, and this is all it takes to use a Hugging Face model. So, you know, you set up this like pipeline object, you say, I want to do summarization, you give it a model, in this case, the BART model, and then you just pass it a string and it'll return the summary. So it's kind of deceptively simple. There are, you know, years and years and years of research behind this, but the broad point here is that this is kind of where I started, the simplest place to start. And actually, when I did this for the first time, I said, okay, let's see what's out there, and let's run a few emails through this. Because at this point, I wasn't really sure if this domain of news articles would transfer that well to the domain of emails, right? And actually later on, I'll talk a little bit about, I think this ends up being kind of one of the weaknesses of the model. But in this prototype phase, I think I was actually fairly surprised how like it worked okay. You know, it'll take I put in a few like of my personal emails, and sometimes it wouldn't, you know, get the right sentences, sometimes it would mess up, but a lot of the time I thought it was interesting enough to kind of go build something around it. Cool. Gonna pause. No other questions so far, D? We're good? Okay.
Yeah, we're clear.
All right, cool. So we have this prototype. So we can run it in Python on my local computer. It's kind of slow, but I think you could run it on a MacBook. It'll take like a few seconds. to compute a result. So what's the next step? Well, next step is deploying it to an HTTP API. Once we have an HTTP API on the back end, we can then kind of build a front end application around it. In this case, a Chrome extension. This is kind of the part where I talk a little bit about Model Zoo. I've been working on this startup called Model Zoo. Basically, the entire goal of the company is to make this stage in a project or whether it's for business or personal use, super, super easy. So this is kind of what it looks like to deploy Hugging Face Transformers model with Model Zoo. I have this kind of like nice API, and you can specify exactly, what resources you want to use to deploy your model. My platform kind of handles everything on the back end. So whereas you would, if you were deploying this yourself with AWS, you might, build stuff yourself or deploy it on Kubernetes or an open source framework. My platform I have a client library that just handles all of this. So with models, it's super easy. However, I know this is an MLOps meetup, and all of you are like really interested in how to kind of build this stuff yourself if you don't want to buy something like this. So I also have this diagram of this is how you would do it if you want to
nice.
do it yourself. So this is kind of what the Model Zoo architecture looks like. So essentially, this will be kind of like hand wavy. I won't go super in depth on each of these pieces. We can talk a little bit more about it in questions later if people are interested. But this is kind of an overview of what the Model Zoo architecture looks like on AWS. So at the front here, I have API gateway and AWS Lambda that kind of every API call runs through this component. I have APIs where you interact with as a data scientist. So if you're like the person that's deploying the model and you're making these calls, this is going to make an HTTP request through that path. And then there's also the prediction API path. So all the front-end applications, web apps, Chrome extensions, mobile apps, whatever that need to actually use these models later, they use the prediction API. And at the end of the day, everything is powered by the AWS Elastic Container Service. So this is kind of like AWS's equivalent for Kubernetes. That's how I think about it anyways. You can put a load balancer in front of it so you can scale up and down replicas pretty easily. And then the Lambda layer also has some communication with metrics. So as the prediction API is making calls to the model, it'll log some metrics in Amazon CloudWatch. And I'm going to store all the model files in Amazon S3. Cool. So now we have an HTTP API. So you can see here's like an example. I blocked out this like API key header that I've been using, but you can see this is what the API looks like. So I make an HTTP request to like this URL, given an input, an API key, and it returns back this result. In this case, the input is summarize this. It's a very short string. So you can actually, this is kind of interesting. You can actually see how the model is biased towards like news articles. If you put in a very short string, the model will just make up stuff, and it'll just make up stuff related to CNN. It'll say like CNN.com, something, something, something. So this is kind of an interesting way you see the data set kind of come out in the model. Cool. All right, so I have this HTTP API. If I wanted to, I could stop here and say, okay, I have this API. I'm gonna like build this project around this API and like offer this API to developers. But I think what made people resonate with this project is actually like up until this point, I think a lot of people have built, APIs and, there's probably if you Google right now, a summarization API, there's probably a few out there. But I wanted to go kind of the final distance and actually make it usable for anyone, people that don't have any experience with machine learning, people that might not even know about these summarization algorithms. And to do that, I think you need a good front end and a nice user experience. So the final piece of the project was learning about how to build a Chrome extension. This was actually the part of the project where I probably learned the most because I was not as familiar with this. And this is an MLOps group, so this is starting to get a little bit out of the domain of this group. I know not all people might be interested in front-end engineering, but basically this is kind of, again, what it ended up looking like. And I also built this kind of pop-up thing here. So I built kind of two front-end ways to use it. One is you can just put it in a pop-up. The other is just directly integrated into the Gmail window.
And I'll jump in real fast. I love how it won't pop up unless you get over a certain amount of words. So whenever I see it pop up, I'm like, oh, it's starting to get too long.
Yeah. So it was really important for me to kind of make an application, at least in this like integrated experience with Gmail, like to make something that doesn't get in your way. If you're already writing short emails, like it'd be really annoying if like every time you sent out an email, it would be like, do you want to summarize this? Like really this is only a problem when, the email's long. And luckily there's a very easy heuristic to check when the email's long. You can just like, I have like a little thing in the front end that just tokenizes the entire email and just only triggers the widget when it's over 100 words. And that was just kind of an arbitrary heuristic, roughly like 5 sentences. But I think it turned out pretty nice because in most cases, if you're writing very quick emails already, like you're not going to see it. But if you're typing out this really long thing, it's kind of this nice little reminder. Even if you don't use the summarization service at the end of the day, you can still see, oh, this is getting like 200 words long. I need to like edit this in some way. So again, I'll be quite hand-wavy in this part. These are kind of the technologies I use to build this part. So React for the front end, like this pop-up window is React. And then for this part where it integrates with the actual email pop-up window, I used jQuery, and I use this library called gmail.js, which I highly recommend anyone who's looking to build a Chrome extension integrated with Gmail. Check this open source library out on GitHub. It's pretty nice. So what this library does is it kind of figures out what elements you need to bind to on the DOM on the front end that Gmail, like the way that Gmail tags those elements on the DOM. So without that library, it might be kind of a pain. You're going to have to like dig through how Gmail like constructs the HTML on their web page. But with this library, you can easily say like, oh, edit the body to say this. And it's kind of a nice little way to bootstrap that kind of work. Cool. And then I at some point, the front end, calls the API. This is the code snippet where it does that. So you can see that at some point, there's a bunch of front end code that says, okay, get the email body. And then at some point, you're going to encode the email body as a UTF-8 string, and then send it to this API that we spun up in the previous stage with these content types and the API key, which is embedded somewhere. And then we get a result. Cool. So that's at the end of the day, all the pieces.
So how long did this take you now to go through from like inception to getting it out? What was that whole process?
Yeah. Most of the time, honestly, was on this front end part because that was the part I was least familiar with. I think probably like 2 weeks total. It really wasn't too much. And I think the key, and 2 weeks, like also at like like 50 to 70% because I was also working on Model Zoo with some customers there. So I think the key is really like, for this project, I really very much approached it from, what is the lowest hanging fruit I can do, right? I can go and train a custom model and try to collect email data, and like that would make it probably better. And I'll talk about it in a little bit. But at the same time, like, can you get to 80% of the result with 20% of the effort, right? And that's what kind of how this project ended up, right? Finding all the kind of pieces of lowest hanging fruit. Find a model that someone's already trained. Use Model Zoo. It's already you can deploy models very easily. Use this like open source Gmail.js library on the front end to like reduce the amount of work there. So stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It seems like you were able to have this idea and it worked out very smoothly considering, right? Like, I don't know if you realized how easy it was going to be, or easy, you know what I mean. But I don't know if you realized it or if it was just like, oh, well, let's find this or that because it's going to be the most simple. Was there like a notion when you came up with the idea that, hey, if I do it like this, it's going to be super simple? Or was it just when you were doing the research that you saw the easier way to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I can separate the two in my head. Like, I might have, maybe when I do research for new ideas, I just like subconsciously like toss them out because I know like, oh shoot, that's gonna be like really hard. But yeah, I think in the probably like, I think like the point here where I tried this prototype, like I have a lot of ideas that I get to this prototype phase and I try it with something simple. And this was really the point of in the like research phase, prototype phase, where I was like, okay, I can actually bring something like this to production.
Nice.
Once I know that, there is a model that is possible to use for this use case with like an open source library that I know is like well supported and like I'm very familiar with. I think that was kind of the turning point.
Yeah, awesome. Just a heads up, I think your microphone is hitting your shirt and it's giving a little bit of static.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So no worries.
Is that better?
Yeah, they're loud and clear. But now you're gonna have to be. I don't want you to have to hold it the whole time.
It's gonna be like this.
One thing that I was seeing someone asking in Slack, they were saying, how does Model Zoo work in the background? Does it wrap the model in a Docker container and launch it? And where does it launch it? Are you using Kubernetes? What's going on there?
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So, so the way that Model Zoo works, essentially, and this, again, this is the interface for Model Zoo. So when building Model Zoo, I saw there's a lot of like open source frameworks out there for model deployment. There's a lot of people that want to build stuff themselves. And I think that's great. With Model Zoo, I wasn't trying to replicate those. I was trying to see what is the easiest possible way to deploy a model. Like, let's go like very extreme. Let's say like, can you get this down to a single line of code? So the way that Model Zoo makes that possible is it puts constraints on what your model is, right? On the types of libraries that you're using, mainly on the type of library that you're using, right? So like if you're using Hugging Face, a Hugging Face model, in the abstraction that Hugging Face has set up for using inference with their models, this pipeline abstraction. If you constrain your use case to that, then Model Zoo can do all this, can make a lot of assumptions about how the model should be deployed, right? I know exactly what Docker image I can use to serve this model, right? I know exactly what code it needs to run inside of that Docker image. I know exactly the HTTP schema that can be used to set up that web service that you can call to make prediction requests to the model. And I know in some cases, I know the resources that are typically required for this model, like the RAM or whether it should be run on GPU and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the short answer is yes, there is a Docker container that is running in the background. That Docker container basically points to a file on S3. And when the Docker container starts up, it downloads that file from S3. It expects, or that those model artifacts from S3. It expects that those model artifacts are in a certain format, and that way it can load up those model artifacts using my like custom web service code that's customized to this Hugging Face use case. And then it deploys those Docker containers on AWS Elastic Container Service behind a load balancer.
So like, is this something that you see, like, I'm trying to see the vision for it, and I think I understand where you're going with it, as far as like, okay, it's going to be commoditized in a way that you're going to have all these different models, and Model Zoo is going to be able to put them out because it already knows about them. And so it's going to make it very easy for those models. And then I'm looking at it like as, okay, if it's an enterprise or a business, is the idea here that you work with them for a little bit and you commoditize all of the models that they're using, or how does that look? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, it's still early days for Model Zoo. I think, there is a possible option of, being like a marketplace for models, like almost like, Rapid API, if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. There's a way for developers to upload any model that they have and kind of sell them. I think right now what I'm really, really focused on is just making the case for data scientists, machine learning engineers that already have models, whether they're in enterprises or working on their own projects, making it as easy as possible for them to deploy their model, essentially, without having to deal with any of this if they don't want to, right? I know This is an MLOps group, and probably a lot of you are very interested in dealing with this kind of stuff, but that's not the case for a lot of model developers out there. Sometimes, it's a small startup, you have a lot of stuff on your plate, and you want to say, let me just like outsource this model, like point and click, drag it, or use this simple Python API to just upload it, and this person will handle it for me. And that's kind of the vision for Model Zoo, making it super, super easy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I've seen if people are familiar with like the whole like web service world, like Netlify, or Render. There's a bunch of these services that platforms that are coming out now on the front end that make it really, really easy to deploy your website, a web service, like a front end web service or any sort of like Docker container. And you can always build this stuff yourself. You can do it on AWS, you can use Kubernetes if you want to, but there is this kind of notion that like a platform that focuses on ease of use is like, saving you time and effort to do other stuff if you're more interested in that. If you're more interested in training models or monitoring them or building an application around them.
Yeah, completely. It's like you're just there for people who are building out the use cases so that they can move faster with these use cases and get something out and easily put it out there. Make sure, hey, is there business value here? If there is, awesome. Let's keep going with it. And maybe they look at doing something more like well-rounded and fuller in the future, but it's an amazing way to just get it out. And so I can see that completely. Now,
absolutely.
I wanted to talk a little bit about how you marketed this, because I think, and this is, I know people probably are like, well, we came for the tech talk, but I think you did a great job at marketing it. And I know there's probably some people that are listening that have ideas in their head and they're like, oh, I got a little, API that I've been tinkering around with or whatever. And I'd love to hear just how that went about, because it feels like you got a lot of traction when you put it out there.
Totally. Yeah. So with marketing, I think really iteratively, I think I very much kind of approached it from um, uh, um, kind of a building in public point of view. That I've seen a few different entrepreneurs do this. A lot of people do this on Twitter. But the very first thing I did with this project, I think I spent probably like 2-3 days building like just an initial prototype, just like something the first version. And then I posted this tweet here. Let's see, yeah, end of July. And this tweet got like, it's not like crazy traction, but it got enough interest that made it, I think it validated me to kind of continue working on this further. So I think, I don't know if this exactly answers your question as like how to market a project that's already built. But I think, the most important thing is building something that people are interested in, that people want. And you can validate whether what you're building is is something that people are interested in without actually like doing all the work, right? Like there's hacks people do. Like sometimes people throw up a landing page and collect emails, without actually building something just to try to validate like, oh, this is something people are interested in, right? So I think there's a little bit of that. I think, some tips for Product Hunt specifically, create a landing page. Like I created this landing page. I think it was really worth it. I created this demo on my landing page, so you don't have to install a Chrome extension to try it out, which I think was really helpful. Because this is a way where it's frictionless to test it out, right? If someone's like interested in this as like on the periphery, but they're like, I don't really want to like go install this Chrome extension onto my computer because I don't really trust it or whatever. Like that's understandable. Like I feel that way about Chrome extensions all the time. But you can try it here, and if you like it, then you can say, oh, this worked really well. Okay, now I'll install the Chrome extension. So kind of thinking about the funnel of how a potential user will interact with your project a little bit, I think is helpful. And then, another quick tip for Product Hunt is if you know any of there's like Product Hunt makers, hunters, that they are like people on Product Hunt that have hunted a lot of other things. So there's people like Chris Messina and like influencers in the Product Hunt community. And if you get them to hunt your product, it actually like serves as like a boost for Product Hunt. So that's just a tip for Product Hunt. If you can get in contact with those people, either through your network or through like a DM or something, like a lot of them are fairly receptive. That's kind of a nice thing.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for laying that out for me. So now I saw what you had that slide, like what's next? And I was going to ask about like, okay, because there's a lot of talk in the community about like canary deployment or A/B testing, shadow deployment, whatever all that means. And so I'm wondering about any of these kind of advanced deployment techniques, and if you have that in the future for what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, not really. Not really like advanced deployment techniques on the technology side. I just created these slides as like basically like some of the two critical pieces of feedback that I got. So I think this is the areas to invest more effort into to make this better, like the lowest hanging fruit. I think there are definitely like, those, all of those techniques you mentioned of like A/B testing and shadow deployments, that kind of stuff, like maybe they could be used in some of these, but but yeah, I'm not sure.
Sorry,
Anyway,
yeah, I
so
wasn't so clear on that. It was more for Model Zoo than for Say
got it.
Less, and if
Got
that will
it. Yeah.
support the.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, with Model Zoo, still early days for the project. So I think I'm mainly focused on the deployment use case right now. But I am working with some customers on, auto scaling use cases that actually support like hundreds of thousands of requests per day. And doing stuff like A/B testing, tracking metrics, logs, more like enterprise like security features, like all of that stuff is on the roadmap for Model Zoo. Yeah.
Awesome. So where are the downfalls that you see in Say Less?
Okay, cool. So kind of one group of feedback is like, oh, the model is not, or like it's not performing in the way I want to. And this is kind of an interesting piece of feedback for a model that does summarization. Because if you think about it, summarization is like inherently like an ambiguous like task, like even if I had like a human like contractors behind this API that were like, going through every email and like summarizing the result and sending it out, there would still be people dissatisfied. Like, oh, they didn't put this period in here. They didn't choose the right word, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. But there was this general sense of, the model's not good enough. It's not choosing the right piece of content. Or one interesting piece of feedback that I found was the model favors the beginning of the email over the end of it. And I believe that that's because that's the way the data set is structured. In a lot of these news articles, typically, I guess like an author of CNN who read a news article, and the first paragraph will be like a summary of the rest of the news article. I think a lot of journalists do this. So the model learns to bias put more weight on the first set of paragraphs, so may take more information from that, the beginning of the article. And I think in general, like that was, kind of even from the prototype phase, one of the weakest parts of this approach is that you're transferring a domain, right? You're training a model on news articles, but then you're transferring to the domain of email summarization. So there's some information that gets lost in that transfer, and the model's not necessarily, trained on the data distributions as it sees in production, right? Emails are not written like news articles in a lot of cases. So I think a big improvement will be to actually gather and train on a real email data set. And this is pretty tricky because email is like a really like, privacy sensitive area, right? It's not like everyone's like sharing their emails. And I think there has been more than a few controversies in the press over certain emails leaking.
You could train on those.
Maybe, yeah. Actually, there is a data set of Enron emails out there, because like once Enron went down in like the early 2000s, some researchers like got a hold of like the emails that were like released to the public, I guess through the court case or something. So that exists. But you don't only need the emails, you also need the summaries of the emails, which is like another kind of, or you could try to like bootstrap it by applying like extractive summarization technique and then trying to train it. But yeah, it gets a little complicated. So these are some ideas I had. Like there's an interesting business model, I think, for this and a few other machine learning use cases are offering a free tier in exchange for collecting your data, which I don't do, to be clear, would say less. It's really important for me to, initially, like, I'm not collecting any data. I want people to be fully comfortable using using this. I like don't log any of your, email text on my servers or in my logs or anywhere. I throw it away immediately. But if this thing scales to a business or something, then I know for a fact there's a few businesses out there that basically with the free tier they use it as kind of like a data collection mechanism, basically to make their models better. Like, I mean, Facebook and Google do this definitely. Probably most other big tech companies.
One quick thing, Alok is asking in the chat, is there a way to pre-process the input, say resize image or clean up text on Model Zoo? Is this on Model Zoo or is this like for Say Less? Sorry, Alok, I'm a little confused. Did you get it?
I think I just signed up for an account and tried deploying my first model, but I was just wondering if you clean up the text or maybe resize images before you actually make the inference, because I couldn't find anything in the documentation.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, custom preprocessing right now is not supported. I think with custom preprocessing and post-processing gets into a little bit of trickiness because you might want to bring in external Python libraries and you have the functions that the post-processing functions that you're writing or pre-processing functions that you're writing might not be serializable. So I'm still kind of like playing around with how I want to support that exactly, whether it's on the front end or some middleware or offering a way to move the processing to this back end. So I'd be curious to chat with you about the use case and kind of bounce some ideas off you at some point. But right now it's not officially supported.
So just real fast, I can't remember, is Model Zoo open source or is there's a free tier, and how does that work?
Yeah, so it's not open source, it's a platform. The client library that you need to use it is like open source in the sense that you can like pip install it. But yeah, it's a platform that is deployed on AWS. So I have different deployment options. You can you can work with me on an enterprise plan where I can help you deploy it on your own like VPC in your private cloud if you want to like pay for the infrastructure costs yourself, or you can use my hosted platform to deploy it or for me to handle all of the model deployments. So you just hit the API and then I'll handle the AWS and like handle your accounts. Data.
So I know this was one of my big questions when we talked last, and it was on if you were going to update to the new Google model that came out. What is it? I never say the name right. GTPCSH3.
GTP3. Yeah.
And
C3PO.
Yeah, C3PO, whatever that model is. I was wondering if you were thinking about that, if that was coming through your.
Yes. Yeah, actually a lot, like the GPT-3 stuff was super inspiring. I was like following a lot of it on Twitter, but I didn't have like access. I guess I didn't have like the right in at like OpenAI, so I couldn't get access to it when I started this project. So I was like, okay, I'll just use the open source models that are out there. In the course of this project, it actually got on the radar of Greg, someone at OpenAI.
So now you have the in.
Yeah, so then I got it. He was like, oh, you can try this on GPT-3. So I did experiment with it a little bit on GPT-3, but I couldn't really get it to work that well, actually. I think even in the GPT-3 paper, it says this, that the use cases for which a fine-tuning data set exists, like summarization, question answering, GPT-3 doesn't actually like perform better than the other models that are out there. GPT-3 performs really nicely in cases where there isn't like a good data set to fine tune on, and you can only feed it like a few examples and it'll pick up really, really quickly. But with summarization, you have like 300,000 articles to fine tune on. So Maybe I didn't play around with it enough, but like in the one shot case, I wasn't able to get it to work that well. I definitely know of a few other teams or projects that have applied GPT-3 to email type use cases. There was one cool project called Other Side AI, which what they did was they said, they built a technology where you can basically give it a list of bullet points, like a summary, and then it will generate a long email. So it's like the inverse of what I have, basically. It like generates an email like in your voice. And I think they did some summarization stuff too. There's a lot of really, really cool GPT-3 use cases for like content marketing, like creating blogs and that kind of stuff that I've seen. But yeah, I think a lot of the cool ones are like, a lot of the ones that I think are really moving the needle forward are where there wasn't previously like an interesting data set to use to bootstrap, to train, to fine tune.
That makes sense.
Model on. Yeah.
So last one, did you have another slide in here on making say less?
I did, but it's not super important. This is just like another slide of like, some people told me the model was slow. Remember, I didn't use any GPUs. But I can, move the model to GPUs to make it faster, or use distillation. So
nice. Well, this has been. Oh, is there something else? The last thing before we end it. We got 2 minutes. You have the last word now.
Oh, I'll just put this this slide up. So thank you all for taking a listen. If you ever want to chat about this project, about Model Zoo, about model deployment in general, I'm all ears. Please contact me on Twitter, email me, add me on LinkedIn. If you want to review these slides, this is the time URL you can use to do so. I also posted a link in the Slack.
That's it. And also, Slack.
I'll post this stuff on Slack as well. Cool. And thank you, everyone. It's been great.
Dude, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you sitting down and explaining all of this to us. I know that I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I appreciate everyone for sticking around and listening. We will see you all next week for more fun. I'll put these slides in the email roundup that I send out on Mondays also, so that in case you want to check it out more, you can. Definitely have a look at Say Less. And if you're interested in Model Zoo, give Yoav a shout, because this is some awesome stuff you're doing, man. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing the time with us.
Cheers. Thank you.
See y'all.